The storm outside was fierce, the sky flashing with bursts of lightning, illuminating the dark, desolate landscape. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the farmhouse, its gusts scraping against the walls like an invisible hand trying to pry its way in. Inside the house was a safe haven, warm and cozy, despite the chaos of the storm. Courage, the small pink dog, sat on the old rug in the living room, his ears perked up as he listened to the rhythmic thrum of the rain hitting the roof. Muriel hummed cheerfully from the kitchen as she prepared dinner, the scent of something hearty and comforting, probably her famous stew, wafted through the air. Easing the tension in his chest, Muriel was always so calm, so kind. Everything felt normal, familiar, safe. Eustace, as always, was hunched over in his armchair, his eyes fixed on the television screen, grumbling under his breath about something he didn't like. Courage often found himself ignoring Eustace's complaints, preferring to focus on Muriel's soft voice or the warmth of the fire. There was peace in this small, lived-in space that made up their home. It had been years since Courage found a family that cared for him, a family that loved him. But then, as the storm outside intensified, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, an imperceptible change in the atmosphere, a tug on the edges of Courage's awareness. The dog's fur stood on end as the room grew unnaturally still. It wasn't just the storm. There was something else. Something wrong. He watched as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. His heart began to pound as a strange, nauseating sensation crept up his spine. Was there something lurking just beyond his sight? The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, his instincts telling him that something was coming. The knock at the door was soft at first, almost as if it were testing the air, but it grew louder and more persistent with each passing second. Who would be out there in this storm? Courage thought to himself, his legs stiffening. Muriel didn't seem to hear it, nor did Eustace. Too absorbed in his own sour mood to notice anything unusual. Courage's heart rate quickened as he scrambled to his feet, instinctively moving toward the door. Another knock, louder this time. A chill crept down his spine. It was the kind of sound that made his blood run cold, a foreboding echo that didn't belong to the warmth of their home. Courage's eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen where Muriel was still humming, blissfully unaware of the dread seeping into the room. His paws shook as he hesitated at the door. Something wasn't right. Then the scratching started. It was slow at first, faint, like the sound of claws dragging against wood, but then it grew louder, more insistent, till it was a jagged scrape against the door frame. Courage's mind raced, his stomach twisted in knots, his ears flattening against the skull. He had to protect Muriel and Eustace. They couldn't know, not now, not in a storm like this. Frantic, Courage grabbed the nearest thing to him, an old kitchen knife from the counter. His thoughts were a blur, everything crashing into one another like a storm inside his mind. There was no time for hesitation. He flung the door open, eyes wide in terror, expecting to see some monstrous being standing outside, something far worse than the storm itself. But it wasn't a monster. No, it was worse. It was nothing, just a shadow in the rain. Before he had time to react, the shadow lunged. The knife went flying. His mind couldn't process what happened next. His paws trembled, too wild with panic to control his movements. The knife sank into the shadow's form, and it screamed, a harsh, gurgling rasp that twisted Courage's stomach in the knots. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should have been standing on their doorstep. The figure writhed, its body contorting unnaturally, distorting into something grotesque. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure collapsed into smoke and vanished into the storm. Courage stood there in the doorway, chest heaving, the knife still clenched in his paw. His head spun, a dizzying wave of confusion flooding his thoughts. Had he done it? Had he killed it? Panic surged through him. He turned to the house, almost afraid to go back inside. What if it was just a dream? What if they were still? The world seemed to slow down as he turned to face the familiar interior of the farmhouse. Muriel was still sitting in the kitchen table, her hands frozen midair. Eustace remained slumped in his chair, his face still twisted into the permanent frown. Everything was fine before the knock, wasn't it? Courage's breath came in a shallow gasp as he stumbled into the kitchen. The house felt wrong now. There was no warmth, no light. The air was heavy with something thick and suffocating, like the storm outside had seeped into every corner, turning the house cold and hollow. He dropped the knife onto the floor. With a loud clatter, his legs gave way beneath him, and he crumbled to the floor, his eyes fixed on Muriel's still, lifeless body. Her hands were stiff, the spoon clenched tightly in her grasp, her once warm face now pale, drained of color. Courage's heart sank, his chest tightening as reality began to settle over him like a dark cloud. No, Muriel, he whimpered, desperately shaking her lifeless form, but her eyes didn't blink. Her lips remained frozen in that placid, unchanging expression. He turned to Eustace. Eustace, wake up, Courage pleaded, but the old man's body didn't move. His grotesque grin was stretched wide across his face, but the eyes were hollow, devoid of any sign of life. Courage's stomach twisted, nausea rising as he backed away from them. No. They're fine, they're just sleeping. His voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Days passed in a haze. Courage refused to accept it, his mind twisting and contorting around the truth he couldn't face. Muriel and Eustace were alive. They had to be. He would talk to them like always, like they had never stopped being his family. Each day he would drag their bodies into the living room, propping them up in their chairs as though nothing had changed. He would speak to them, tell them about the day's events, about the storm, about what he had seen outside. Muriel's eyes, though empty, were always there, staring blankly at him. Eustace's mouth stayed open in a twisted grin, but Courage saw it as a smile that didn't belong. Sometimes he would hear Muriel's voice. It wasn't her voice, not really, but it was soft and familiar. Beck, come, Courage, it would say, calling him into the kitchen, where the pot of stew always seemed to be simmering, its contents just barely edible. He would go, dripping the spoon into the vile muck, and lifting it into his mouth without hesitation. And sometimes Eustace's voice would rumble from the chair. What's for dinner, boy? He would ask, but there was no humor in his tone. Only the hollow echo of something that used to be Eustace. But Courage didn't see it. He couldn't. He refused to. His world was falling apart around him, and he could hear nothing but their voices. Couldn't feel the rotting decay that was seeping into their bodies, into the house. They were still there. They had to be. And then came the whispers. Faint at first, but louder every day. The walls, the floor, the shadows in the corners, all calling him, all telling him it would be fine. He could make it right. He just had to keep them close. Keep them with him.
Come closer, Courage. They won't ever leave you. You'll never be alone again.
One night, as he sat in the living room, the house grew colder. He could feel it. The storm outside raged, but inside, the air was thick with something unholy. His eyes darted towards the chair where Muriel's body sat, and something shifted in his mind. There was a voice. Muriel's voice. But it wasn't hers. It whispered from the darkness, calling his name, urging him to look closer. He turned to Eustace, who was still slumped over, the grin still on his bloated face. Come closer, Courage. We're still here. And in the dark, he could almost see it, almost hear them. Muriel, Eustace, they had never left.